Back to Morning Lifestyle with Dave for a Monday morning. Now, I don't know if you caught up with the story last week. It was one of the papers that the NDIS has an underfund of around about $140 million in Tasmania. Not so much an underfund, but money that's in the pool that hasn't been spent. And I'm not quite sure why this is occurring. And a man who's right over the top of it is River Knight. He's the co-founder of Developing Australian Communities. And he's joining us. River, $140 million that's there to be used and hasn't been.
It's a lot of money, isn't it? And I can guarantee that the population of people with a disability in Tasmania are certainly not sitting there, not needing that funding. They're certainly crying out for it. So we're not quite sure why the funding isn't being allocated and spent. However, we do have a pretty good idea and a few really good theories on what's actually happening.
Mm-hmm. But roughly 140,000 people in Tasmania with a disability. How many would be eligible under the new NDIS system?
So nationally, it's kind of about 1 in 10, but in Tasmania, you've got about 10,270 people registered as participants of NDIS. So they're people with a disability that I guess need actual funded supports. However, it doesn't mean the rest of them don't need it, because we're also getting a lot of stories where people are just having a hard time even getting into the system.
So the money's there. What happens to it if we get to the end of the financial year and it hasn't been spent?
Well, in previous years, those billions of dollars, because we're talking about a $20 billion program around Australia, goes back into the coffers of their government and helps with their claims around surplus. What we're finding, though, is even in Tasmania, with over 1,000 registered service providers, they're experiencing the same problem, which is nationally we're looking at about 68% of people who do actually have funding not being able to spend the funding. So only about 68% on average of people's funds are even being, spent even when they have the funds in the first place.
Mm. Now, I heard recently, and I must say I'm certainly not an expert in the space, but they were talking about some sort of a program where you'd have to go and see an independent person that would assess you and then decide on whether or not you had too much or not enough. Or where's that one in the space, and how does that work?
Well, what they've done is they've kind of put a bit of a pause on that, because what we sort of said as a sector is that a lot of people already have OTs, physios, medical practitioners, service providers in their lives providing these reports with recommendations about what services a person needs. So having an independent person who costs more money again, coming in and vetoing all of that doesn't make sense financially. It's a waste of taxpayer money. But there are people in the system where they don't have access to all those services and professionals, and they actually do need someone to come in independently and go, you know what? You need the services, you haven't got things in place. Let me just help you quickly get things rolling, and then we'll get the rest of the professionals in. So we found that it was a blanket approach, and everyone kind of said, you know what, that's completely silly. They've put a hold on it, but what we want to do is, it really was about trying to work on people's funding and maybe cut funding where they could. It was a budget strategy, but it was one that was going to be a blanket system, where it really wasn't necessary, because service providers, we don't expect gold Rolex watches for all of our participants. We certainly know how to do things on the smell of an oily rag. It's about making sure that people get consistent decisions by NDIS, and that's the thing that we've got to work on.
What about the number of service providers in Tasmania? Are there sufficient there? Are they staying in the game, or are they saying this is all too hard?
Well, what we find with service provider numbers is it doesn't match whether or not they're actually able to provide those services to the population. So what we saw with NDIS is the funding went from being sitting with service providers to all going into individual allocations to individual people with a disability, which is a great idea to individualise things. But what happened is, for example, in the past, the government would fund my service to get set up, to sit there in regional areas of Tasmania rather than sitting there in Hobart or Launceston, having those services ready to go outside the major centres. And then we were able to say to participants, we're here, come to us, we'll be able to provide those services. Those services, a lot of them lost the funding, they closed down, and now they don't have the funding to be sitting there ready to go. So the funding sits with the individual. So now I need to find someone who's got a lot of money, maybe inherit some money, do some fundraising to set up, and then those participants can come. So what we're finding is people can't find the services, especially in regional areas, but also just connecting with those services. Because you can imagine a Yellow Pages book with, say, 15,000 service providers in Australia and going, well, like, how on earth do I pick the one that's right for me?
It sounds like it's an extremely complex system. Is there a way to streamline it?
Well, what we're looking at, and the things that we're talking about in the sector with all of the 15,000 service providers and the participants, and going to the Minister about, is saying, no, we need to have a tiered approach. So we need to have some funding for those services to be supported, especially for regional areas. Because I spent years working in Tasmania, and I used to have an office in Devonport, Burnie, Launceston, Hobart, all over the place. And you need to have the resources to be able to cover all those spaces. So we need that funding for service providers as well as the individual funding, I think, for the participants. But one of the things that we try to do is create those big spaces for people to find service providers through our expos. But of course, we don't have them in Tasmania at the moment because we just don't have the population, the funds for that. But just having that facility to find and connect with a service provider that you feel comfortable with is probably the biggest hurdle.
All right. Well, we thank you very much for bringing our attention to it, and we hope to see that the space changes and the money gets to the people that desperately need it. River Night, co-founder of Developing Australian Communities, thank you for sharing your knowledge with our listeners this morning.
Thank you so much.